which is on industrial policies for business investment, and I'm going to hand straight over to our chair, Åsa Johansson. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here in this fantastic room. I am really impressed by the niceness of this room. It's a great opportunity. So I'd like you to welcome you all to this high-level panel on industrial policy for business investment. So over the next hour and 20 minutes, we will examine the key trends shaping business investment across countries and how policies can support business investment. So just to give you some background on this session, so as you all know, that business investment is a key driver of productivity growth and long-term economic growth. But we also have seen across OECD countries that investment has been weak, and it's been particularly weak since the global financial crisis. And this has occurred despite historical low financing costs and strong corporate profitability. And today, in many of our countries, investment is well below the trend that we observed pre the global financial crisis. So the question is, why is this the case? And this is something that we will explore in today's panel. But we've also seen happening at the same time that we have seen a shift in investment patterns from tangible to intangible capital, such as ICT software, data, and R&D. And this is something that is happening across some of our economies, and it will be very interesting to hear more from our panelists on what can be behind this type of shift in patterns. And it brings us to the topic of today, and that's on industrial policies. How can industrial policies help shape and stimulate private investment, both traditional investment in tangibles, but also in intangibles? So we will hear from our panelists on this, and we will first have a keynote presentation from our Bart van Ark. He is Professor of Productivity Studies at the Alliance Manchester Business School at the University of Manchester, and he's also a Managing Director of the Productivity Institute, which is a UK-wide research organization focused on advancing productivity, understanding productivity trends. So Bart will give a keynote presentation, and after that we have a distinguished panel of three panelists. I will let them introduce themselves. So I hand over first to my colleague Phyllis, who can introduce herself now.
Sure. Hi, good morning everybody. I'm Filiz Ünsal. I'm the head of Structural Policies and Research in the Economics Department of the OECD. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Yasuhiro Suzuki from Cabinet Office of Japan. Thank you so much for today.
And we also have Fred Perry, who is Director of Industrial Strategy Unit at the UK Department for Business and Trade, who will be joining us very shortly. So let's kick off this session with the keynote from Professor Bart van Ark, and I give you the floor, Bart, and you have 15 to 20 minutes to give your presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Asa, and good morning. And very grateful to kick off this session on investment and business investment. Obviously, investment is a key plank of industrial policy, but there's probably no better place than the UK to actually observe that this is a big challenge, because certainly in the UK, where we have decades of, as we heard the minister saying this morning, of broad-based underinvestment in many respects, this is the right place to understand what that means and what the implications of that are for industrial policy. But I'll also show here that a lot of this is not just about the UK, that we see this slowdown in investment much more widely. And the three things I really want to bring home this morning in my keynote is, first of all, when it comes to sort of directly focused investment policies, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that has already been picked. And frankly, a lot of the dogs that should bark when it comes to lower investment don't really bark at the moment, and certainly don't bite. So we need to think more broadly around factors that are playing an important role. There are much more structural factors that I will talk about in a bit more detail later on. And I'll also argue that a lot of the high-hanging fruit is really about joining up different types of pro-productivity policies, as I would call them, with investment policies to make investment really working again as a key part of industrial policy. So what I'll do is I'll first very briefly, that's part of scene setting after all, a couple of minutes talk about recent trends in investment across the OECD and why it has slowed, and I have the benefit of having been able to make use of the latest OECD Economic Outlook that was published in June, so I'll show you a few slides from that. But I really want to spend most of my time on the more structural factors on investment. This is partly the shift towards intangible investments and various components of intangible investments, and some of the societal challenges that we're facing, notably demographics and aging, which I understand was an important topic in the Productivity Forum last year, but certainly an important element of the industrial policies as well. And then I'll talk obviously about some of the implications for this. This is the first chart from the OECD Economic Outlook published in June. The left chart is showing you the net investment to GDP ratio for 32 OECD economies with the interquartile spread that you're seeing there. And you can see that business investment has been slowing very significantly. There are, of course, the big shocks of the global financial crisis as well as of the pandemic. But I think what's important here to take away is that after both shocks, investment hasn't recovered to the level where it was before these shocks. And I think that's a very widespread phenomenon across many economies. What is particularly nice about this chart are the other two. And I think that's really good that we also have a chart on housing investment and a chart on public investment. Because I think when we talk about investment policies, we really need to broaden this to those two key elements. Housing investment, again, has slowed and actually not really recovered. There's a bit of variation here, but it's more to the lower end of this. And this is really very challenging. Obviously, it's partly related to migration issues, it's related to planning issues and infrastructure issues. But it's very hard now to see how we can get a business investment agenda going without a proper housing investment agenda. And this is perhaps even more so true for public investment, where it's a much wider spread in terms of performance, but again, overall a pretty clear sign of a slowdown after a brief pickup during the pandemic. And again, given the big societal changes that I will talk about a little later on, is something of critical importance. So this is one key takeaway, I think, is that business investment need to really be linked up with housing investment and public investment to fully understand this investment story. Now, investment, as we all know, is a flow concept, and if we really want to understand the impact on growth, we need to translate it, we need to accumulate it over time and translate it into the growth of the stock of the capital, and that's what you're seeing in this slide for various OECD economies. And again, you can see very widely a slowdown in the growth of the capital stock over the longer time. You can see that some of the European countries are highlighted, the UK, but also France, Germany, all at the lower end. At the higher end, you see some of the more emerging economies, although there are also some emerging economies at the lower end of this chart. But the slowdown is really pretty widespread. But even the growth of the capital stock is not the whole story. Growth is one thing. The other thing is the level, because this stock accumulates over time. It creates the asset base in the economy that is delivering those services over the longer term. And this is a good place to refer to a piece of work done by Tara Allas and Demetrios Angelis for the Productivity Institute a couple of months ago, showing that because of this very long chronic underinvestment in the UK, the amount of capital per worker in the UK is now about 1/3 of what it is in some peer countries like France, Germany, the US, the Netherlands, and so on. And of course, what that means is that actually there's a capital gap in the UK of about 2 trillion compared to these peer economies. And even if the UK would have an investment to GDP ratio of 4%, it would still take about a century before it would actually close this gap. So the key message from this really is that this asset base is critical, and if you deplete this capital stock over a long period of time, it is very, very hard to recover from that anytime soon. And that is a situation that quite a few countries are now facing. Also, in case of Brazil, Argentina, South Africa, some of the emerging economies, we have seen this slowdown in capital stock happening. The last slide I want to show is from the OECD Economic Outlook is the impact on productivity growth, or in this case, the growth of the potential output per capita in 24 relative to the average from 2002 to 2008. And again, we can see that in 2024, the growth rate of potential output per capita had slowed significantly to other economies. So in the median advanced economies, the slowdown in potential output per capita has been 0.8% on average, of which about 0.5% is due to weaker capital deepening. In emerging markets, it has slowed by as much as 0.9%, of which 0.3% was due to capital deepening. But what this chart also shows is that there's lots of other factors, the green bit, that are accounting for the slowdown. So this is not just a capital story. That goes back to my key point here. Investment policies cannot be seen on its own. It critically depends on other factors that are influencing productivity and potential output per capita growth. And we'll come back to that topic a little later. Now, of course, we could spend the remaining 15 minutes on what are the main causes of this business investment slowdown. This is a really nice chart, also done in the OECD Economic Outlook, that shows the sort of long-term trend, the pre-global financial crisis trend, which is the black line here of real business investment, and then divide it up into two parts. One is the sort of the role of demand. So it's basically, you know, if the economy slows, investment is going to slow. That accounts for about 1/3 of the investment shortfall that we're seeing. And the other 2/3 is what might be called the investment gap. So this is basically the supply side of what we're looking at. And basically, I think this supply side can be divided up into three key elements. The first element is basically sort of the usual factors that are impacting on investment. Including, you know, the cost of capital, you know, the corporate taxes, company valuation, all those kind of things. So that is one element. The second element is uncertainty, and then the third are sort of other factors and more structural factors. And I think that these, also all these three factors matter. You know, the investment policies, the usual investment policies, as I said, that dog doesn't really bark. You know, we have seen declines in used cost of capital, we have seen improvements in company valuations, we have seen declines in corporate taxes, and this has been true for most countries, and still we see investment not recovering. So there's just not happening a lot in that space. Uncertainty does matter, and it accounts for about 1/6 of that overall shortfall in investment, but the structural factors that are going to have a long-term impact are playing a very big role. And that's obviously where the role of industrial policy, which, as Diane said earlier, is so much a long-term focus, is coming in very importantly. So what are the structural changes? Again, I would divide them up into three groups. First of all is the shift in investment from tangible to intangible capital, obviously related to the rise of the digital and knowledge-based economy. The second are some long-term transitions, which is in particular the role of demographics and aging, as well as the role of climate change. And then finally, there are systemic changes in corporate investment behavior that seem to be impacting the business responses on the basis of these usual indicators that drive investment. As I said, the dogs don't bark, really. And the question is, what is it that is changing here in respect of the responses of business? Now, I don't have the time to go through all of those, so I'm going to focus on the intangibles part, partly because we've got a lot of really new insights from that. I'll see if I can talk a little bit about demographics, but I'll have to leave the business responses and corporate behavior largely to the session later today, which is on business dynamism and market and competition policy, so that will certainly come back. And I'll make one or two remarks about climate change if time allows. So, starting on intangible capital, we're really benefiting here from a recent work by the World Intellectual Property Organization with the help of the EU CLEMS Int and Invest team at Lewis University in Rome. That really allows us to update these numbers on tangible and intangible investment as a percentage of GDP up to 2024. So this is incredibly helpful because we have real-time data that we can work on. And just for those of you who are sort of familiar with intangible assets, this is the broad concept of intangible assets. So not only the intangible assets that are in national accounts, like R&D and software, but also intangibles like organizational capital and things like that. And you can see how much that gap has now increased, how much more important, again, across OECD economies, but this also includes countries like Brazil and India, how that gap has increased over time. And that tangible investment as a percentage of GDP really has declined, but to a large extent being offset by the rise in intangible investment. Large differences, though, across countries, and that becomes even more clear from this chart from the WIPO, which shows on the one hand a few what you could call intangible intensive economies on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, tangible intensive economies. And it's actually quite striking, and this really comes out, I think, very clearly from the data now, how large the differences are. That countries like Sweden, the US, France, also the UK, really see this widening gap that we saw in the original chart. But then on the right-hand side, we see countries like Italy or Spain, but also Germany, where intangible capital is still catching up with the share of tangible capital. Now, some of that is obviously related to industrial structure. Services tend, particularly business services and professional services, tend to be more intangible intensive than manufacturing is. That could explain part of the issue in Germany. There might be an element of catching up here as well, which might apply to Spain or perhaps even to Italy. But I think there is a reason for us to think about what other factors could possibly play a role in these very large differences in intangible versus tangible capital between countries that are at fairly similar levels of development. And I think that is quite striking, and I think a lot of the research is now indeed going to suggest that maybe intangible capital responds differently to these traditional investment policies than tangible capital does. So recent work in the Productivity Institute by Catherine Mann and Yongji Chui has actually been showing that indeed intangible capital is less sensitive to declines in the user cost of capital, partly because intangible capital relies to a greater extent on internal financing, because there are longer investment horizons on intangible capital. There's a lot more uncertainty on the investment outcomes, and there's also a much more limited extent of collateralization of intangibles. So I think a key question for investment policy is, are the investment policies of today really the right investment policies for the parts of intangibles that really count? Very quickly, a lot of the evidence is, of course, for advanced economies, but the great thing of the WIPO work is that they have now included emerging economies as well. Here you see just India and China. Frankly, the rise, India and Brazil. Frankly, the rise in intangible investment in India is faster than the increase in France, the US, or Sweden, although, of course, from a much lower level, and the share of intangible investment in the overall investment portfolio is still quite lower. But these countries are definitely beginning to see similar kind of trends. This slide is quite important because when we talk about intangible investment, we need to begin to break it down because it's such a large group of different types of investments. And of course, and I'm sure that we'll talk a bit about it in the panel and in other sessions, the rise of the digital economy, and notably in the last few years, the importance of artificial intelligence, is giving a lot of push to the role of software and data, to the role of financial products, even R&D. So you can definitely see faster growth in those areas of intangible capital. But if you look at the right-hand chart, you actually see that 30% of that broader intangible concept is organizational capital. So this is about managerial capital and about organizational design and about marketing and branding and those kind of issues that you see on this chart as well. So I think one thing to really think about is not just think about intangibles in terms of the tech side of this, but also in terms of the business innovation side of this. And certainly as AI is gradually beginning to mature and we're beginning to talk much more about the users of these new AI technologies, this sort of business side of intangible capital may become much more important. And again, the question then is, are our policies ready for that? Is industrial policy all focused on the tech side? Or is industrial policy also more focused on, are we able to adopt these new technologies across the economy, which probably goes more in the direction of the horizontal part of industrial policies, as we were talking about earlier, than the vertical part of these kind of technologies. So, taking this all together in a growth accounting framework, here you can just look at the contributions of intangible capital, which is the green stuff here, tangible capital deepening, which is the red stuff, and total factor productivity growth. I think what we see is, yes, intangible capital is becoming increasingly important as a driver of productivity growth. You can see that these green parts increasing in most countries. But it's not enough to offset two major other trends. One is what we already have seen, the declining role of tangible capital deepening, which is all the red stuff that is becoming less important. And then, of course, the role of total factor productivity, which has become a big drag on productivity growth overall. And I think this is really important. I mean, last year I published an article, Are Intangibles, under the title, Are Intangibles Running Out of Steam? And that depends how you look at it. If you look at it from the perspective of labor productivity growth, of course not. We see that intangible capital is becoming more important as a driver of labor productivity growth. But when we look at it from the perspective of whether intangible capital is still driving total factor productivity growth, which is our long-term source of economic growth, there are a lot of questions still to be answered. And I think that is a key question for industrial policy. Can we make sure that intangible capital is creating and continuing to have these spillovers to total factor productivity growth as it used to have in the past? I'm going to be very quick because of time. Chair, I'm not sure how much time I actually got left because I didn't count.
No, but
I'm good?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll nevertheless focus a little bit on one aspect of the long-term economic changes, and that is the role of demographics. And as mentioned earlier on, this was an important topic in the Global Productivity Forum last year, but it is going to be a key driving factor behind how we're thinking about industrial policies. These are data for the euro area from the European Stability Mechanism, a brief, very interesting piece of work that is showing, first of all, how the labor force growth, the yellow line, is gradually going to decline over the next 20, 30 years or so, and how at the same time the dependency rate, which is sort of between 58, 60% on average in the euro area now, is going to increase to over 70% in about 20 years' time. So this is a massive change that will definitely happen, because we all know that this is one of the most predictable things in terms of all the data that you can possibly look at. Now, of course, it's hard to still fully understand the implications on productivity. Of course, a shrinking workforce is not necessarily a good thing for productivity. Very important from an investment perspective is that public investment may increasingly be targeted on things like education, reskilling, but especially also healthcare infrastructure and those type of activities, which typically may be sort of lower productivity investments than the kind of investments, business investment, that we would like to talk about. Those of you who were at the reception last night may have heard Wendy Carlin talk about not all sectors in the economy need to be productive. And certainly in an aging society, we'll definitely have more sectors that probably are not and perhaps shouldn't be a lot more productive in order to deliver the quality of services and the outcomes that we really want to achieve. So that's a big challenge. Now, of course, you could say, yes, but aging populations means labor shortages, so here is the real opportunity for AI and automation. That's true. And it's also true that older workers, we're all getting older, and still most of us, luckily, are healthier than our parents and previous generations. So we can be more productive for a longer period of time if the right tools are being available to us. But on balance, this same study by the European Monetary Mechanism is actually showing that there isn't really a lot of evidence that we are actually beginning to look at a positive effect of aging on productivity. This is just a simulation exercise. If you give a 1% shock to the dependency rate, what would that mean? And one of the takeaways here is that actually output, as a result, is going to decline even faster than employment. And as a result, productivity is actually going to decline in going forward. So there are lots of other questions to still be asked here about what these investment shifts are all going to mean for long-term economic growth. I think a key aspect which sort of been shining through most of my remarks here is the importance of thinking more broadly around productivity. Already I talked about housing and public investment, but also there is now increased interest in sort of broadening our concept of capital and resources. This is work that was originally developed by the ONS. Later also Diane Coyle, who spoke earlier, has picked up on this and has written extensively about this in her latest book, The Measure of Progress, on how important it is that we think not just from tangible capital to intangible capital, but begin to think of some other measures like social capital and institutional capital, and also natural capital. I didn't get to talk about climate change, but obviously, as we are depleting our natural resources more and more, and as well as big challenges with regard to biodiversity, thinking from a climate point of view, an environmental point of view in terms of capital terms about natural capital is critical. That will also have implications on how we measure outputs, and we have to move from GDP to broader terms. Now, you could easily argue, look, we can't measure all this. It will take decades before our research agenda will get anywhere close to measuring. We just don't have the time as policymakers, you don't have the time as policymakers, I should say, to wait for that. So we have to further work in this very difficult environment where we have sketchy evidence. We know this is important, we just don't know how important it is. But just sticking to this sort of narrow concept of capital and a narrow concept of GDP is probably not the best guide for getting to effective industrial policies going forward. Okay, almost there. What does this mean for policies? My colleague Dirk Pilat, formerly at the OECD, and I have been working recently on some work around pro-productivity policies, as we would call them, of which industrial policy is just one part, and of which investment policy, or I would say the accumulation of production factors, is an important part. But you can see on the right-hand side, again from the OECD Economic Outlook, that a lot of these policies are being implemented right now. So tax policies, all the policies that you want to do, all these dogs that I say that should be barking but don't bite, they are being implemented. Now, of course, there's still some countries that need to do work in this respect, and they should definitely catch up on this very quickly. But I just don't think that these traditional investment policies are going to change the needle very much. We need to really think about investment policies in a broader context, where technological change, including intangibles, structural change, including vertical industrial policies are going to play a role, but also the more indirect pro-productivity policies, competition and markets, which have been extensively mentioned, internationalization, which was mentioned by one of the questioners, but also the foundations of our institutions in an economy. Do we have sufficiently stable institutions in order to deal with these big challenges, including this broader thinking around capital and around output? So what are the implications here? Sluggish investment is obviously not good news for industrial policy, but we just have to be clear that investment cannot be seen in isolation of these other pro-productivity policies. Capital is highly endogenous and is depending on a lot of other factors. Investment is increasingly intangible, and that seems to suggest that traditional support tools don't really work that well, and that we have to be a lot more creative and imaginative about which tools can possibly work. Targeted sector policies, so vertical policies and horizontal policies, need to be joined up. Policy stability reduces, why did I miss the word uncertainty, but you can fill it in. Obviously, uncertainty, as I said, accounting for 1/6 of that investment gap, needs to be dealt with. Broader capital concepts are necessary to think more inclusively about global growth. And then I didn't get to talk about place-based, but again, it was mentioned earlier. We have another session around this tomorrow. But it is so important to understand this on a place-based perspective. And I have to say, kudos to the DBT and the new industrial strategy, where place-based policies are featuring very prominently, and frankly, a lot more than what I have seen in other countries. We need to understand the implications of these industrial policies on a place-based perspective, and we hope to hear a lot more of that later on during this forum. And with that, I'll leave it and hope there's enough on the table for further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bart, for setting the scene so well. Now we will turn over to our panelists, and we'll go in the order that's in the agenda. So our next presenter will be Phyllis Unsal. You have 10 minutes, Phyllis.
Thank you. Thanks. Good morning, everybody, again. It's very nice to see you, all the familiar faces. And I'm very grateful for GFP for providing us this opportunity to come together once a year to discuss the productivity-related issues and move the frontier a bit more. So I'm going to talk about today the weaknesses of business investment at the OECD countries based on our recent work, which Bart, as Bart also mentioned, that was featured in our economic outlook, but also some other recent work that we have been doing in the economics department. Then, linking my presentation to the topic of the conference, I will talk a little bit about also the policies and what type of role, particularly public policies, can play in boosting business investment. So, as Bart discussed, investment has been weak at the aggregate level across OECD economies. Across OECD economies. Now, from these aggregate numbers, I would like to pick up a little bit and go deeper at the sectoral level. What we see in the chart on the top is that we show that the sectoral trends that we observe on average across OECD countries regarding investment to value-added net of depreciation. Here you see that for all these sectors, there's a strong negative trend. Despite some sectoral heterogeneity, you see here that, for example, the negative trend was very strong for capital-intensive services, such as transport and storage and water management, and is a bit less in the case of professional services. So the second chart instead decomposes this by country in terms of the role of within sector patterns and sectoral allocation. Somewhat in line with the first graph, this shows that the strong negative sectoral trends are actually the dominant factors across countries. And also they drive the cross-country differences. On the other hand, when we see the role of within sector reallocation, between sector reallocation, which is painted by orange here, you see the very, very small role for it. So most of the weaknesses in investment is driven by within sector changes. There have been, however, some bright spots, and one is the digital and knowledge-based economy. On the one hand, the traditional assets, such as structures, buildings, offices, and warehouses, or the machinery, shows a very little dynamism, around 0 to 2% increase per year since the global financial crisis. On the other hand, when you focus on the digital and knowledge-based assets, here ICT software, hardware, and research and development, you see that the increase in investment around 40–10%, much higher than the rest. Of course, here we should emphasize that there are complementarities. We also see this in the context of, very clearly, in the context of AI. You need to combine data centers with algorithms. These things go together. So it's very difficult to think of some of these digital elements separately from each other, but you see the very clear trend. Here, of course, I should mention that what Bart mentioned, which is the complementary intangible assets, are as well very important, since we look at here the national accounts, which unfortunately doesn't cover that key organizational changes that these technologies needs to bring in order to bring the productivity increases that we hope to have done from. So now, more recently, looking at the firm level, we can also look at the role of AI in investment. Here we rely on the measure based on patenting activity in AI-related fields, such as deep learning, as well as hardware development. This chart is based on listed firms across the globe, including the US, Europe, and China. On the left panel, we see that from mid-2000s, firms that are active in the AI-related fields increase their capital expenditures very significantly, while the other firms remain stable as a share of their sales. On the right panel, we observed a similar trend, but with much dramatic increases in terms of the R&D expenses. So notwithstanding this increase in AI-intensive firms' investments, strong investment dynamics, we know that the other firms are much less active. Here, this chart shows that most of these firms, instead of investing more in assets, they actually prefer to accumulate more cash, which you can see on the left side, and also they provide return to shareholders, either dividends or share paybacks. And we see this very strong increase since early 2000s. Now, how to interpret this increase in this change in the firm behavior? One interpretation could be that firms now need more cash in order to do investment in intangible assets, which tend to be very difficult to borrow against, which could be a good interpretation and a positive one. However, they may be also doing this in order to do more mergers and acquisitions or by competitors, which we indeed see some trends in the data. Moreover, what we also observe is that they just use more cash to return to their shareholders, which is a clear sign that they do not carry out investments at the levels that we expect. Overall, these patterns indicate that firms do not prefer to invest as much as their earnings when we compare with the previous periods. So now, this is also the case despite relatively favorable structural and policy conditions that we have been seeing over the last 2 decades. You see here that the user cost of capital has been declining at the top. And of course, this is driven by mainly 2 factors. One is the falling real interest rates. Even compensating with rising depreciation, still the borrowing costs have been declining. And on the right side, you see the falling corporate tax rates and falling relative price of investments. So it seems that the environment, the policy and structural environment was also favoring the firms at some point historically compared to the historical trends, but we don't see the investment. Now, this brings me the role of policies. So here, it's clear that there is some incentives that needs to be done, and there's a clear role for policy. There are a couple of important policy levers that we identify in our work. One is competition. This decline in investment also coincided with firms increasing their markups and increasing market concentrations. So what happens is that these firms with high profits tend to be also the ones that are investing a lot. Therefore, there's a bit of a winners-takes-all dynamics, which we know that was happening in the digital sector. We have been also observing very clearly in the digital sector. Now, when we look at our policy recommendations from the economics department for each countries, out of 54 countries, we see that around 37 of them, competition policy reforms came as one of the most important policy priority in order to resolve the investment slowdown. So what we have done also to see how we can quantify the impact of these reforms on GDP and investment. And here I am presenting you the quantified impact of these structural reforms, that's both competitions and investment-friendly reforms, and what could be the impact of this on GDP and investment. So for an average OECD country, if they can close the gap between the top OECD performance, their GDP per capita will increase 3% in the medium term, and out of this 3%, 1% will be investment. So we are talking about a very large gains here in terms of the linking from reforms to the investment gains, and therefore potentially on productivity. Now, we talked about competition, but of course, obviously, one of the other important development was that uncertainty has been increasing, particularly recently. And so this high level of uncertainty, of course, may hold back investment and induce firms to postpone their investment decisions. Here we see that on the left side, the average uncertainty has been increasing, particularly since even stays at a very elevated level, even from 2015. And this type of uncertainty has a big impact on investment. We try to quantify that with the graph on the right, and you see that 1%, one standard deviation increase in the uncertainty bring about 1% decline in business investment. This translates that if we can bring the uncertainty back to the levels in 2015 to 2019, we would actually double the business investment around the OECD economies. So I stop here. Thank you so much, and I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Felice. Very interesting. And I'll hand over now to our next presenter on the stage, which is Yasuhiro Suzuki from the Cabinet Office in Japan.
You have 10 minutes as well.
Okay. Okay, thank you so much for the kind introduction and for the opportunity for today to speak this one. I'm honored to present on Japan's recent investment trend and the corresponding policy responses. Oh, sorry, this is the top page. First, let me discuss Japan's long-term economic trend. Since the 1990s, Japan has often been described as the lost decades. As you can see the two graphs on the screen, the nominal GDP in Japan has slowed in 1990s, and the GDP per capita is also the lowest among the G7 countries in PPP terms. We face the similar challenges in investment. Since 1990s, the real gross fixed capital formation has stagnated for an extended period. Due to the declining residential investment, the cautious corporate investment attitude, and public investment cuts, the real investment totals remains broadly flat for approximately 30 years. And this investment stagnation has also contributed to the decline in the potential growth rate, as shown in the figure on the right. And there are several factors behind this investment stagnation. First is the corporate demand and investment outlooks fell in the 1990s and stayed very low, so restraining the investment. And the right side, the second is the profits. The profits have shifted towards the overseas investment and dividend and reserves rather than the domestic investment or worker wages, so shown in the blue and red dashed line near the bottom. Third, the Japan's business entry and exit rate are far lower than in the US, so it is limiting the competition and innovation. The fourth, the ICT investment index shows the Japan's lagging behind the G7 peers, showing the Japan's delay in digitalization. However, the structural changes brought by the pandemic and global inflation have triggered a sign of change. Corporate appetite for investment has been strong in recent years. The business survey shows that corporate equipment investment plans have recorded significant increases for 3 consecutive years. For FY 2025 as well, the companies plan to further expand investment, indicating that this strong investment appetite continue. There are also changes in investment quality. In addition to the traditional tangible asset investment, the investment in intangible asset is expanding rapidly. So increasing by 46% from the 2016 to 2023. Behind this lies the movement in 2 particularly important areas among intangible assets, the R&D and software investment. One is the expansion of R&D investment in manufacturing, especially the machinery, the motor vehicles, and chemicals. They are driven by the decarbonization and digitalization. The other is the rapid growth of software investment in service area, especially in the retail trade and accommodation, food services, and construction. In this area, firms are automating to cope with the severe labor shortage and shifting consumer needs. Together, these trends enhance the enhanced investment quality and are becoming a key point of Japan's recovery and structural changes. Based on these developments, making this momentum solid and connecting it to the sustained wage growth and investment expansion is a policy priority. So finally, let me introduce the 5 important policy challenges to structurally support the investment expansion. The first, we are working to improve the macroeconomic environment. Our focus is on the overcoming the deflation and facilitating a transition towards an economy where both the wage growth and investment serve as the engines of sustainable growth. Second is the industrial policy that we aim to stimulate the private investment in strategic sector with high spillover effect, such as green transformation and digitalization. Third is the trade policy. Amid geopolitical risks, we will reinforce the supply chain resilience while preserving the free, open, and rules-based trade and investment system, leveraging the economic partnerships such as the CPTPP. Fourth is the labor market reforms. To address worker shortages and skills mismatches, we support the digital reskilling and smoother career transitions. Finally, startup policy. Under the 5 years plan, measures include the diversifying the funding sources, leveraging the public procurement, and encouraging the open innovation. By comprehensively promoting these policies, we will sustainably revitalize the Japan's investment and Japan's macroeconomics, and finally contribute to the global growth. Thank you so much. That's all.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Yasuhiro. And now to our last panelist, Fred Perry. So please take the stage. And again, you have 10 minutes for your intervention. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It's good to see you all and be speaking with so many of you about UK industrial policy. So to introduce myself, I'm the Director of Industrial Strategy in this government, and I hope many of you will have read our recent publication this summer and therefore already have a bearing on what we devise within it. But as sort of the policymaker on this panel, I'm going to speak a bit about how we devised our framework and brought it together, how it responds to some of the trends and economic models and forecasting that you've heard about already today. So here's the glossy document itself. How did we approach the problem? I mean, you've seen a lot of the international comparisons on business investment. It's fair to say that the UK fares quite poorly, certainly in terms of tangible business investment over recent decades. But as some of Bart's and the OECD data kind of charts show us, far better on the kind of intangible side as well, probably reflecting the strengths in our economy around services and digital and technologies as well. So that was the kind of context we were responding to. Also, we had a new government, kind of politically, the Labour government have come in, but industrial strategy for this country has been something that has crossed and traversed different political parties. So I think we've had over a dozen of them since the turn of the century. And for us, we had one by Peter Mandelson of the kind of Blair government. We had one by Vince Cable, who was a Liberal Democrat in our political system. And we also had one by Greg Clark, who's a Conservative politician, all led as kind of secretaries of state. So a real sort of smorgasbord of different sorts of schematics and variations on industrial policy to pick from. So sort of last summer, I and the team were considering what are the things we could approach in terms of this industrial strategy. Why might it be different? I think the first thing to say is that business investment we had identified as the critical problem. We had a long-standing team of economists who were brilliant, some of whom were in this room, who had been studying these issues for a long time and had a firm grasp that ought to be the core metric on which we devised our kind of overall strategy. We then knew from the Labour Party manifesto and the government as they came in that they wanted a critical focus on sectors. I'll come more onto sectors, but I think the sort of driving philosophy that we were using in terms of our policy making was that there were a group of sectors that were driving the most growth in the economy. Certainly over the past couple of decades, I think a third of our economy had contributed to over 2/3 of our productivity growth. And so the sense was, can we find ways where our policy backs these sectors as the ones that will be more catalytic, drive more market dynamism in the economy over the decades to come. So that was the philosophy behind why we wanted a sectorally based approach. I think second, we wanted to tackle barriers in the economy, and we did that in a couple of ways. So first of all, we had the brilliant team with us who were able to lead quant work and look at, based on multitude of data, including some of the materials you've seen, but also survey data, what were the kind of big cross-cutting, some supply-side issues that were affecting these sectors in particular. We were trying to make those the focus of our attention. I think second, we also wanted to partner with business and do that in a different way. So we ran a consultation and pushed that, I think, perhaps harder than we have under previous guises, and from it received I think it was 27,000 data points that we had to kind of make our way through, drawing on AI, but also, again, using our brilliant people to ensure that we captured the specific insights that were coming through those. I put some of the cross-cutting themes here, energy, regulation, funding gaps, but we were trying to drill into what were the specific issues around getting a grid connection in the UK in certain places that was causing a barrier and getting beyond those general thematics. We also knew that there are kind of opportunities in our economy as well, so beyond the kind of sectors I spoke about, place, it was a big opportunity. Sectors, of course, cluster in places. In the UK, we had to consider our 4 nations, including our devolved nations and governments, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, but also the English regions, which are anything from consistent with a myriad of sort of local political governance as well to map, and trying to ensure that while we were listening to our regional leaders, we were also identifying the strength of sectoral clusters that were not politically governed, i.e. not overseen by mayoral authorities, for example. So the huge themes to pick up on, as well as on, skills is probably another good one to bring out as well. We're thinking about what we could do in terms of reskilling, what were the occupational packages that cut across some of the sectors that we cared and were putting our focus on that we needed to address. So a future-facing approach. The sectors themselves, we chose 8 growth-driving sectors, which are probably too small for you to see, depending on your eyesight on this chart. But I think a few things to draw out from the choice, which was based on multi-criteria assessment. The first is that growth was our number 1 objective. Unsurprising to hear that, given this government's focus on the growth mission. But we also had sub-objectives around net zero, around economic security, and around place. So in choosing these sectors, we were scoring and trying to assess those factors to ensure that we had a really holistic choice, and we're thinking about future-proofing and using different lenses to select those sectors. I think the second thing to bring out is, as I said at the beginning, we wanted to reflect a modern economy and the UK's economy as well. So professional and business services are in there, financial services are in there, digital and technologies are in there. I think it's fair to say that predecessor industrial strategies in the UK had some focus on services, but never quite as emphatic in terms of the inclusion of the ones that we selected. And then finally, you can see, or rather you can't see, but underneath each of these 8 groupings, we sort of dialed in to see which were the subsectors effectively that we thought held the most growth promise. So moving beyond kind of just electric vehicles, for example, and thinking about maybe aerospace is a good case study where we're thinking about the forms of technology that are going to drive decarbonisation in aviation, and for example, looking at liquid hydrogen propulsion as the technology that we thought not only held most promise, but in which the UK had the most sense of revealed comparative advantage. Obviously, we think we put a hell of a lot of analytical rigour into the choice of these, but it's fair to say we'll also want to assess them over time as well. And maybe not every single bullet point on this chart is necessarily going to prove to be a growth success, but our assessment is that by selecting them, we stand the most chance of success. Of course, by choosing sectors and taking active industrial strategy decisions, you are not choosing as well. So I'll come on to, but in prioritising our resources against these sectors, one is also making an intrinsically very political decision, and this is less part of, I suppose, the kind of economics of industrial strategy, but an important kind of priority for us as policymakers was how we still worked and communicated with some of the sectors who weren't selected as well, who in different ways play very important roles in the economy, and thinking about the wider role of government that government would need to play with those sectors as well. So, development and kind of implementation. I've spoken a bit about trying to consult a lot with the outside world. It's also fair to say that we wanted to make this really holistic across government. and involve many departments. That was because we developed essentially the fundamental principle that we wanted to tilt policy towards the 8 growth driving sectors. So that was not only spending and what I would call very crude and simplistic industrial policy making around subsidies that did exist for some of the sectors in question, and whether we had in terms of the overall spending envelope that prioritised towards the sectors we cared about, but also supply side measures across sectors and places. So that's thinking very much around, as I said, our kind of skills budget and policies, and whether we were engineering those and directing those towards the growth driving sectors, right through from a place lens to thinking about whether our transport budget was adequately prioritised around some of the places and clusters and corridors that we'd identified as being most important for the growth sectors. That involves a lot of departments, and we did a count the other day. We think of the 24 ministerial departments in government, 21 of them were very meaningfully involved in the policy-making process. I needn't tell many of you who work within complex institutional systems how much governance and hard work and soft skills that required from the team, but to ensure that we genuinely had a whole of growth kind of whole of government approach. And we're working with those departments that weren't classically growth departments as well to bring them into the conversation. So whether that's kind of around bringing the health department on life sciences policy that wasn't sort of directly kind of related to their goals, right through to the Ministry of Justice and their role in terms of the legal services sector and the role that plays within the broader professional and businesses sector as well. Finally, maybe the thing to just sort of round up with was our intent to create capability over the long run. As I said, over a dozen strategies since the turn of the century. Why could ours last perhaps longer than some of the predecessors did? I think the main vehicle we have used to essentially be an exemplar of that is the creation of an Industrial Strategy Council. Those have come before, but we've committed to putting this one on a statutory basis, i.e. we need to legislate for it so that it will become ultimately part of an act of Parliament. But the body itself is also important. It is a group of economists. Diane, who I think was here earlier, is one of our members. And we have a number of business leaders as well from across our 4 nations. Their job is to support us, but also monitor the sense of how well we have implemented what we said we would, and also that we continue living the spirit of industrial strategy. I don't pretend that we solved industrial policy in one go this time. We will need to look at the policies that emerge over this Parliament and shape all of them with that industrial strategy lens. That is the core of what we're trying to do. I mean, alongside them, we've also created new teams within government, and I think particularly important that this has happened not only from the Business and Trade Department, but from the Treasury as well. I think I saw Anna earlier, who was part of the Treasury and fully kind of alongside our efforts to ensure we were jointly shepherding that across government and using the power of the Treasury alongside the Business Department as well. So we now have our 700 odd commitments to look at implementing, but as I say, we've got a really sort of complex and deep work programme ahead of us to see ultimately, are those policies going to make a difference to the business investment and kind of core problems you've heard about earlier today. I'll stop there. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Fred, and thanks to all of the panel and for the scene setting by Bart. I think we have had a very good discussion so far on some cross-country trends. We have seen a discussion on the shift towards more intangibles and all around those issues of complementarities and broader capital. We also heard about some strategies from Japan and the UK on how to implement industrial policies. So now it's time to open the floor for discussion and questions to the panelists and to Bart for setting the scene. We have some good 20 minutes, so the floor is open. So please reach up your hand, and we'll give you a mic so we can ask your question. And we also have the opportunity to ask questions online. So I see, I think it's a lady over there on the right side. Yes.
Thank you very much, Tara Alice from McKinsey. Thank you, first of all, for all of those brilliant presentations. There's just so much to absorb. A theme that came through in a number of them was around uncertainty. And that's a word we hear more and more all the time. And I guess an example of mitigating uncertainty is the industrial strategy, of setting out some kind of clear delivery milestones for government. But there's a broader issue here, and I wanted to see if the panel has suggestions for how governments can help with this issue around uncertainty. Should they try and reduce it? And if so, how, considering that they will have to keep responding to the world around them, including what other countries get up to? Or should they help businesses be more resilient in the face of it, or to be able to take risks despite uncertainty? And if that is the answer, then how could they go about that?
Yeah, since I mentioned about uncertainty, I can maybe give a few words. It's a great question. As you mentioned, setting out a strategy for private sector and the other economic agents to know how government will respond to certain situations in the case of lower productivity growth and weaknesses in investment is very important. Of course, when it comes to uncertainty, it's not just about external. There is also the internal part of it, which governments have certain control over it. The clarity on the policy, obviously, the transparency and in the case of AI, for example, the most recent development to try to avoid geopolitical fragmentation on the AI regulation. We put out the OECD AI principles in that respect. So it's very important to provide clarity and transparency and to set out a framework to how they should respond to. However, this may not be enough, as you mentioned. There could be some external shocks that are outside of the policymakers' control, and therefore I think the agility of businesses to respond, to act in these environments and invest is also important, and financial sector has a big role in that this is their job in some ways, that in the face of uncertainty to still keep the lending going, and part of it will be the financial regulation that perhaps after the global financial crisis, we went in the direction of regulating and taking maybe too little risk, and maybe we reached a point where that there's not too much lending going on. So some of these things may need to be rebalanced, maybe going forward to see if we can provide more room for innovation, for entrepreneurship, and ultimately productivity and growth.
Thank you, Phyllis. That's a good perspective. I think perhaps Bart wanted to come in on this question as well.
Yeah, I think it's actually a great question because, as you say, every business and everyone is, complaining about uncertainty. But what would be good business without uncertainty? I mean, it's about taking risks and it's about entrepreneurship. And a lot of entrepreneurs I talked to, and I'm sure you did in your McKinsey practice, Tara, they love this kind of uncertainty. But I think there are different kinds of uncertainty. First of all, of course, there's the global uncertainty that's happening around geopolitics, which is very difficult to manage and to deal with. And we all have to deal with that, not just the business community. But there's also the policy uncertainty in terms of the chopping and the churning. And Fred, I think, was describing earlier how many kind of industrial policies we have been seeing over time. And with every new government, actually with every new minister coming in, there was another change of policies. And these policies are there to define the guardrails within which companies can thrive and can take risks and so on. And it's these guardrails that I think need to be sustained over a longer period of time. And I think, and I hope that this policy in the UK and what we're seeing in other countries lives up to what Diane said earlier this morning, is that we need the kind of longer term focus within which they can operate.
Thank you so much. Anyone else would like to come in on this question, or we take another one from the audience perhaps? Yes, the gentleman over there on the right-hand side, please.
Thank you. I'm a legal advisor from Taiwan. In the first session and this one, we heard the theme on the move, the shift to intangible. In Asia, I think there is a debate going on whether or not that is a good trend to go, because by moving to intangible, the traditional manufacturing industry is declining, and which used to employ quite a few labor. So those unemployed labor is now moving back to their hometown, and therefore the consumption, the overall productivity is slowing down. So I would like to hear what is your comment on the debate and the choice, again, for the policy. Thank you.
That's a very interesting question. Perhaps we can hear from the UK's perspective on that, because I'm sure that there's something that you've considered in your industrial plan. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So I guess one take on it is that is kind of intangible and tangible investment as sort of separate, as is sometimes kind of implied by the charts. And I suppose I think when I was part of supporting the electric vehicle industry in the UK, we were looking at investments in connected and autonomous mobility. And the degree to which that could act as a pull-through for the competitiveness of UK auto industry, indeed many other manufacturing industries as well. So I suppose one thing we've certainly tried to do in our industrial strategy is think about, I learned the posh word for this, but is interstitial kind of benefits between sectors that could help with technology transfer and modernizing in certain sectors our approach. So that is just one kind of sectoral, I suppose, lens on the question.
Thank you so much, Fred. I was wondering, in the Japanese industrial strategy, do you have a take on how you see this move towards more intangibles from tangible, and how are you thinking about that in the context of developing your strategies?
Yes, I think of course the shifting to the intangible asset is very important, but balancing both is also important, I think. So yes, Japan is facing the labor shortage. This problem itself is a serious problem, but increasing to cope with this difficulties, it is also, both of the approach, increasing the tangible asset and intangible asset can be effective. So considering the specific situation and choosing and balancing both is needed, I think.
Thank you so much, Yasuhiro. I'll take a question now from the online, which is related to what we've been speaking about, and it's to Bart. And the online question is that, Bart, you stressed the importance of organizational capital in your presentation. Could you comment on synergies with digital capital, and how crucial is investing in organizational capital to leverage digital tech?
Well, leading into this question, if I may respond very quickly to the previous question, because I think it's a mistake to argue that the distinction between tangible and intangible is a dichotomy between manufacturing and services. Although it's true that services have been faster in terms of adopting a lot of these digital and intangible kind of investments, manufacturing has a lot of opportunity. And of course, in the age of robotics and so on, we see a lot of that actually happening at the moment. So even though industrial structure, for example, in Germany, you could argue that the lower level of intangible investment is partly related to a larger share of manufacturing. I think that catching up is really, really important. So I think that's critical. And that actually feeds into the second question, because as I argued, I mean, one thing is about where are the tech companies that are actually inventing all this stuff and that are producing all these new technologies, and where are the users? Now, the users are everywhere. The users are in advanced economies, they are in emerging economies, and the users will become increasingly important because they are a much larger part of the economy than the producers of these kind of new technologies are. And that's where organizational capital comes in, because to the question about, yes, you can adopt a digital technology, but it immediately raises questions not just about the skills of your workforce and the investments that you have to make in updating the skills of the workforce. It's about managerial capabilities to change the design of the organization. It's about the way that people are actually collaborating. There's a lot of evidence, for example, that softer skills matter a lot more when it comes to the adoption of these kind of latest technologies than the sort of hard tech skills, which are important too, but probably for a smaller part of the workforce than the longer one. So the complementarities are clearly there. I think the question is about the spillovers, which I mentioned earlier, of these kind of technologies on total effective productivity, and that is still, I think, a very open question, and a lot of that has to do with competition and market dynamics and other things we get to talk about later.
Thank you for that. I'll see, I have a question over here, the gentleman to the right, please.
As I said before, Salvatore Zecchini, formerly University of Rome, hired 4 interesting presentations. Still, I have a number of points. I'll limit myself to 2 points. The first, related to measurement problems with respect to organizational capital and intangibles. There might be a case whereby productivity statistics do not actually reflect the entire gist of what's going on. So my question is, how far do you see these measurement problems biasing our, let's say, opinions? And the last point is related to the UK, but as well as to other countries. How do you deal with the declining industries? Because the UK said that they are focusing just on frontier industries, not the rest. What about the rest? For instance, steel industry, chemical industry. Are we going to surrender everything to China and then become more dependent? And the same applies to Japan. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that question, or the 2 sets of questions. And on the first one, maybe I will tag on something as well, and not only measurement of organizational capital, something also how do you capture the value of data in all of this discussion, because that's something that also is probably becoming more and more important going forward. So I don't know who wants to take a stab on these questions. Perhaps we can hear from the UK first on how you deal with the other sectors been left behind, and the same from Japan. So UK.
Yeah, thank you. It's a very good and difficult question. I think the first thing to say is that in choosing the sectors that were shown on screen, as I said, economic security was a consideration, and for each of them, we are now mapping the supply chains and what we call the foundational industries that are kind of associated with them, with which they will need to work. That is difficult for the obvious reason that one's kind of import dependency is difficult to predict in terms of what ultimately needs to be a sovereign capability economically relative to the importance we also need to put on our fiscal framework. But we are doing the exercise to identify which we think will be most important, and I think it's obviously a revealed policy preference of this government that some of those industries are critical enough, I think, to our economic needs, and hence on steel, you have seen that we have intervened to support that industry. So there is a way of classifying it in our overall strategy, but that is also where our further work now needs to come into play, and why it's sort of not a once and done strategy document, and we need to play a sort of ongoing role shaping policy.
Thank you for that perspective. Yasuhiro?
Can I answer the first question?
Of course.
Okay, thank you so much. The point he pointed out is very important, I think, and it is very difficult, I think. So on one side, it is very important. Before the investment, checking the scheme or something in advance is very important. But at the same time, doing something after the investment, like setting the KPI or doing the EBPM well or such a things is also needed. And at least in Japan, sometimes we are criticized. Such area is not so strong. So yes, it is very difficult. So that's why we have to try to understand what the spillover effect or what the real effect is happening, I think.
Thank you so much for that perspective. Perhaps, Bart, you want to take a stab at the measurement question and the other one too?
Thanks for giving us some time to think about that question. I mean, we talked a lot about living in a world of policy uncertainty, but we live at least as much in a world of data uncertainty. And I think a lot about this question, because we as researchers talk about all these new opportunities that we have to do better measurement. But the questioner is exactly right. There's a lot of uncertainty around what these measures exactly mean. Now, obviously, we're making progress. We now see in the next system of national accounts, we'll see more intangibles adopted. And once it goes into the system of national accounts, is a good sign, because it means that we really get to fairly solid measurement procedures. As academics, we'll experiment a lot more, we try a lot more, and it's good to see that policymakers also look at this, because we can't wait until the next system of national accounts come along. Some of you who are familiar with that know that takes quite a bit of time, and as I think you know a lot about that too. So living with the data uncertainty is critical. Stress testing of the data is important, identifying where are the real weaknesses in these data. So to your specific question on organizational capital, I think a lot of my questions are around the lifetimes of these kind of investments, right? We tend to sort of, make them very long, but a lot of organizational capital perhaps doesn't last all that long in this sort of rapidly changing kind of environment. So we can play around with this, and we can see if that's going to change anything of the insight. So what's the bandwidth within which we have a certain great amount of uncertainty around these data, I think is very important. But that data uncertainty is a reality of policymakers' lives, and I think you will have to embrace it in order to bring, industrial policies into a new era.
Thank you for that. I'll go to the online question. There's a question for Phyllis. And the question is that in your presentation, you highlight the surge in digital capital investment. But one question that comes to mind is the role of AI. How important is business investment in AI within this trend? And what could industrial policy play in this area? Over to you.
Yeah, thank you. So most of the charts that I show you today actually covers the last 2 decades. So they of course precedes the development of AI. However, of course, AI have been around for some time, and some of these differences, particularly between the US and Europe and the rest, will be driven by the developments of AI. We see that since 2015, there has been an increase in the AI investment. I also show you the chart on this, both in terms of capital expenditure and research and development. Of course, we have done some further work on this, and it seems that actually in terms of the investment performance, the difference between Europe and the rest of the economies is mostly driven by digital investment. So there's a divide there that is potentially could be even more pertinent going forward, and hence the role of policies. Here, of course, obviously, it's very important that the certain digital infrastructure in terms of connectivity and the permits for building data centers has to be there. We need to look at the energy needs of the industry and respond to that. One of the other issue when it comes to AI and also more broadly digital investment is obviously scalability. We have seen a lot of companies that, because of these reasons are shifting positions or bought by others. So this is very important. Of course, financing comes in mind. Somebody in this conference has to say capital union, so I will be the first one saying it, that it should happen. But of course, it doesn't end there. As I show you, it seems that there are other important incentives that covers both the regulatory part as well as the scalability part that the governments may need to attack, and obviously the infrastructure. Here, when we look at the AI adoption at the OECD, we do a lot of work on trying to come up with the macroeconomic impacts of AI. And the productivity impacts range from 0.1 to 1.5. One of the most important drivers is the digital infrastructure, how companies can adopt AI, whether they can do it or not. So I leave it there, how important the digital infrastructure could be for the productivity gains.
Thank you, Phyllis. Very interesting. And I think we have a question from the audience on the left-hand side down at the end, please.
Hello, thank you. My name's Jeff Tiley. I'm from the Trades Union Congress in the UK. Fred mentioned fiscal frameworks, and I think Secretary General Corman at the start talked about the fiscal context. But in the UK, there is some discussion about the role of the Office for Budget Responsibility and whether its modelling or its approach might be counterproductive in terms of investment agendas and agendas around industrial strategies. So, I mean, without putting Fred on the spot, I wonder if the OECD might be able to advise from their view of country experience whether other countries have got a better approach to making the two agendas compatible. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I don't know if Fred, if you want to have a stab at that, or if it's...
I guess what I'd say is we're trying to work incredibly closely with the Treasury and where we can with the OBR, because I think we have agreed on the consensus around business investment being the issue that we want to adjust for with our policies. But in the industrial strategy, we didn't get into that macro kind of debate. It wasn't a macroeconomic policy-making device, and partly given restrictions on me, I probably shouldn't say more than that.
Thank you for that question. I think we have, if there's another question in the audience, we have time. Yeah, I see one at the end, at the back on the right side.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for the wonderful presentations, Urvashi from DCMS. Going with the running theme of intangible capital, two of the presentations, I think Bart, yours and Felice's, showed the increasing market concentration where tech investments are, where investments are fastest, there's also increasing market concentration. And I know you're going to cover it, some of it, in business dynamism. But what does the panel think are the most effective vertical industrial policies that future-proof some of this, some of what is happening? Because clearly there aren't enough spillovers happening from a small number of large firms that are also very AI-intensive, that are appropriating most of the benefits of productivity and capital investment at the moment. Thanks.
Thank you for that question, and I'll open it for anyone in the panel who would like to have answer that question, perhaps.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It's a hard question, but I just tell you, to point you something that I think is important. You know, when we think of market concentration, it's not always bad, because there is the innovation part, especially in the context of intangibles and digital investment. As I mentioned before, scalability is very important, and profitability sometimes drives innovation, which we see this in the US with big firms. So it's really striking the balance between innovation, productivity, as well as trying to keep the market dynamism alive. And this is, I think, one of the biggest questions we are facing. Maybe we will find some solutions today.
Thank you for that. Anyone else feels a hankering for taking a stab at that before we close this panel? Bart.
Okay, I'm happy to close on an optimistic note here, although it's more hope than that I can really prove this. But what we do know is that companies very widely adopt AI. It's not always effective. You know, if you just look at the percentage of adoption rates are relatively low, because companies still struggle about even what AI exactly is. But if you talk to them in reality, there's virtually no company that's not using ChatGPT. Come on, they all do it. The question is they're not quite sure yet how to integrate this into their business process and how they can get faster growth out of it. But I think that will happen, and I think we're entering in this next phase. And I think AI is actually, in that sense, perhaps even a better technology than some of the previous digital technologies to have a lot more companies benefit from this. The question is, do we have the policies that are focused on diffusion, that are focused on these other parts of intangible capital that allows these companies to increase their absorption capacity and to be able to implement these kind of technologies productively? So I might predict that in a couple of years' time, we may actually see that differential between high concentration and lower concentration, and companies that are not benefiting from this coming down a little bit. But let's see when we come back in a few years.
Yeah, let's see in a couple of years. But that's a positive note, and it's been a great panel. And I think let's thank the panel with a good hands of applause.
All right, everyone, and that's lunch. Thank you so much. Please make your way next door. We'll be starting the next session at 1:35, which is an hour. Interesting, when I spoke to someone from the French side yesterday, they said, oh, that's a very short lunch break. And I said, that's really funny because the UK people said that's a very long lunch break. So that tells you a little bit something there. For those of you who want a bit of a breath of fresh air, if you go out the main door and round to the right, it's definitely worth taking a look at a 3rd century Roman wall, the remains of that, which is the one part of the fort of Londinium, which then became the city of London. So do enjoy that. I was once talking to a development economist who drew me a map of the UK and pointed to all the major towns and cities that were once the sites of major Roman fortifications, and how many of them are still sort of rooted in that very original choices around where to build our big kind of regional bases. And then he pointed to the map, and then he said to me, that's the power of path dependency. So I think he basically said to me that we're competing with the Romans as we design our industrial policy. So I'll leave you with that as well as you look at this wall. Enjoy your lunch. Be back at 1:35 sharp, please.